Greetings to everyone joining us for this message. Being seen is a very important thing for human beings. We want to be seen. In the Zulu greeting, we say Sawubona, which in a crude translation means I see you. Now, there was a movie a few years back, Avatar, and in that story, they borrowed, I think, from the Sawubona, from the Zulus, and they used this greeting in that movie of saying, I see you. And in the passage of today, we are introduced to this idea of seeing people, because we see that in the ministry of Jesus, one of the things that made him do things that he does is because he saw people. He saw the woman who was bent over. He saw the woman who has been sick for many years. He saw the lepers. He saw people. And because he saw them, he saved them. And the question we need to be approaching today's passage with is whether, as the followers of Jesus, we see people. So let's go to today's passage, which we find in the book of Luke, chapter 19. It's a familiar passage which often is used in Sunday school. It's one of those passages that are good for Sunday school lessons. But I don't think that when Luke wrote this, he had Sunday school kids in mind. He had you and I in mind. He had adult people, old people in mind. So let's look at what Luke would have wanted us to see in this passage that he records, that many other Gospels don't record. This, I think Luke is the only one who covers this particular story. And it's because Luke, in fact, was looking for people in his, so you read the whole Gospel of Luke, you find that Luke is telling us about people that society did not see, but people that Jesus saw. And if we are descended disciples of Jesus, maybe what Luke is saying to us is, can we begin to open our eyes and see the people that Jesus sees? Let's read our passage from the book of Luke, chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. Then Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Now behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, for he was of short stature. So he ran ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him, and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. But when they saw it, they all complained, saying, he has gone to be guest with a man who is a sinner. Then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. That's Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10 in the New King James Version. Now I want us to go through this pericope or this passage and see what Luke might have had in mind when he tells about this. Because those who are following these passages of the lectionary, you'll know that last week, Luke told us about the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector who went to pray. And we know earlier, Luke also gives us the parable of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son, because he wanted to teach us about people that Jesus saw that nobody saw or everybody rejected. And this is one of those stories that Luke is using to show us the people that Jesus saw. So it says when Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Now, when we hear about Jericho, those of us who are familiar with the Bible, we know Jericho for one incident that happened in the Old Testament, in Joshua chapter 6. That's the story when the Israelites arrived in the promised land. Jericho is one of the first towns or first villages that they took over. So when they came there, the city was fortified. It had walls around it. And Joshua told them they must walk around the city for 6 days, once a day. And on the 7th day, they walked around the city 7 times. And then they blew the trumpets. And the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. And I think in this story, Luke has found a perfect example of how to bring down the walls of separation, the walls of hatred, the walls of discrimination. Because here we find that there was it's a story of discrimination where somebody was being discriminated by society, was ostracized. And Jesus came to bring down those walls that were separating this man from other people. So it says, as we continue, now behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Now, I want you to see how it says, now behold. Behold means see. Okay? I want to play with this theme of seeing because you'll find in this passage the word see is mentioned so many times. And so I don't want us to miss that. Okay? Now behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. See a man named Zacchaeus. Now why does Luke call us to behold this man? Why does he call us to see this man Zacchaeus? Well, there are 2 things. Firstly, he says he was a chief tax collector. Now, in the Bible, in the gospel specifically, we know that tax collectors were ostracized. In fact, it is said when people came across a tax collector, they will spit and look away. Because that's how sinful and dirty they saw tax collectors. In fact, they didn't want to be seen talking to tax collectors. Everybody avoided tax collectors. So chances are tax collectors didn't have Jewish friends. They probably had Roman friends, they had Greek friends, they had other nationalities. But among the Jews, if you were a tax collector, you probably did not have any friends. Even your family could have rejected you if you were a tax collector. And so Luke starts by saying, see Zacchaeus. Behold Zacchaeus, a tax collector. So he is forcing us to see this man today. And also this man was rich. So tax collectors tended to be rich because they used to collect money on behalf of the Roman government. They were hired by the Roman government to collect taxes, and sometimes they will collect more than they need to give, and they will pass on the money to the Roman government, but they will keep some for themselves. And so most of them became very rich because of that. So he is one of those that was very rich, probably because of his profession of being a tax collector. But one important thing also is to see that he says he was the chief tax collector. So he was probably not the guy who goes around collecting taxes. He probably had tax collectors who reported to him. He was a senior person, and other tax collectors reported to him. And so you can imagine, therefore, that he must have been well known, but people must have hated him and avoided him at all costs. So this is the man, therefore, that we're introduced to. A man that is despised by society, that nobody wants to be seen hanging out with. A man who was rich, and we know that some of the teachings of Jesus was that the rich will find it difficult to enter his kingdom because of what they do to poor people. And so this is the kind of man that Luke wants us to see. This tax collector, this chief tax collector that nobody wants to be seen with. And let's see what he says then in verse 3. And he says, and he, Zacchaeus, sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, for he was of short stature. So this man that nobody wants to see, He wants to see Jesus. He sought to see Jesus. He was seeking to see Jesus. But I think Luke is clear here. He doesn't want us to think that he just wanted to have a glimpse of Jesus and say, I saw him passing. He wanted to know who Jesus was. This is what it says. It says he sought to see who Jesus was. So Zacchaeus was not just looking to have a glimpse of Jesus. He wanted to know who Jesus was. You probably have heard of him. Remember, one of the disciples of Jesus at this point is Matthew, who used to be a tax collector. It may well be that Matthew used to report to Zacchaeus. And maybe that's how Zacchaeus became interested to know who this Jesus was, because one of his tax collectors had defected, has left the profession, is now following this man, Jesus. And so maybe that's the reason that Zacchaeus is interested to know who this Jesus is. So this is not about seeing somebody passing. This is about getting to know somebody. That's what he wants to do. So he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, for he was of a short stature. Now, by saying he was of short stature, I think there's an important point that Luke wants to make, that this is not simply being short, this is being extremely short. That when you are in the crowd, you can't really see because the average person is taller than you. Now, you know that when you are short in a crowd, that's often what happens. So that's why you probably have to be sitting up on stage or climb up somewhere and so on. So what does Zacchaeus do? It says he ran ahead. So it looks like he tried to see if he can see Jesus in the crowds. But because the crowds were so many, he couldn't. So he decided, okay, because they're going this way, let me go further down and find a tree where I can go up and be able to see him properly when he gets there. And so he runs down the road. So he ran ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree. To do what? To see him. That word again. For he was going to pass that way. Okay? Now, you and I know that if you see an old person like me climbed into a tree, that's very odd, even by today's standards. Now, it was not only today, even those days, for a man of his stature to climb into a tree. Now, this is, if you like, this is the head of SARS, if you like, in the area. This is the head of the tax collecting agency in the area. And everybody knew him because he's the guy that everybody knows and people avoid him. And that's the man who, because he wants to know Jesus, he is willing to run, firstly, because it says he ran down the road, and secondly, to climb into a tree. Only children do that. But as old as he is, with the stature he has in society, he climbs into a tree. This is what Zacchaeus does. He doesn't say, I'm too important to climb into a tree. In order to know Jesus, he forgets about embarrassment. He forgets about thinking of himself highly. He humbles himself and he climbs into a tree so that he can see him. And then it says, and when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him. That word again. Okay, remember? Let me just go back one verse. He ran ahead and climbed into a sycamore tree to see Jesus. But when Jesus comes there, it says he looked up and he, Jesus, saw Zacchaeus. So Zacchaeus climbs the tree to see Jesus. But when Jesus comes to the tree, he looks up and sees Zacchaeus. Now they see each other. But the point there I want to make is that Jesus sees this man. The man that nobody wants to spend any moment with. The man that nobody gives any time of day. Jesus sees him. Jesus came to the place and he looked up and he saw him. And this is what Jesus says to him. Zacchaeus, make haste and come down. Think of that. As soon as Jesus sees him, he calls him by name, Zacchaeus. And of course, there are multitudes of people who are walking with him. The disciples of Jesus are there with him. So Jesus comes to the place and he looks up. What does everybody else do? They also look up. So when Jesus sees Zacchaeus, they also see him. Okay? Those that were walking with Jesus, when Jesus looked up, because he stopped and he looked up into the tree, and everybody stopped and looked up to see what Jesus was looking at in the tree. And Jesus saw Zacchaeus, and everybody around him also saw Zacchaeus. And then Jesus surprised everybody, and even Zacchaeus. He says, Zacchaeus, he calls him by name. So Jesus knows this man. Now, the way this story is framed, it is clear that Jesus intended to meet Zacchaeus. He says, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down. Come down quickly. Now, this is a very intentional statement. It is clear that Jesus had a purpose in mind. He doesn't say, come down. He says, come down quickly. For today, I must stay at your house. Now, when you hear the word today in the Bible, today is associated with salvation. Today is the day of salvation. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2, Paul writes, for God says, at just the right time, I heard you, I saw you. On the day of salvation, I helped you. Indeed, the right time is now. Today is the day of salvation. So when you hear the word today, you must think salvation when you read in the Gospels. Somebody is about to be saved. And so Jesus says, make haste and come down, because today I must stay at your house. Today I must live and sleep at your house. Now, this is not saying I'm coming for dinner. This is saying I'm going to sleep over at your house. Jesus is inviting himself over to Zacchaeus' house. He's not allowing Zacchaeus to invite him. He is inviting himself. Now, that's the way salvation works. We don't invite Jesus into our lives. Jesus comes into our lives. Okay? The way salvation works is by grace. We're not the one who makes the choice that I want Jesus to come to me. Jesus is the one who comes to us. But he comes to those that seek him. Those that are seeking him, Jesus comes to them. Now it is clear that maybe somebody like maybe Matthew, who was a tax collector, maybe he had told Zacchaeus in Jericho, who would love to meet you. He wants to know you. And when Jesus was coming to pass Jericho, he decides this is the opportunity to go see Zacchaeus. So when he comes there and sees Zacchaeus in the tree, he says to Zacchaeus, today I'm coming to your house. And then, so Zacchaeus made haste and he came down. Okay. Now I want you to see that Jesus says, make haste and come down. Come down quickly. And then Luke continues to say, so Zacchaeus came down quickly. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. Now you can imagine the excitement of Zacchaeus. He was seeking to know this Jesus. You probably have heard a lot about him, but he wants to know him. But he knows this Jesus is called a rabbi. And rabbis don't like to be seen with Zacchaeus. But now, this Jesus, this rabbi called Jesus, says, Zacchaeus, today I'm coming to stay at your house. Jesus is inviting himself into Zacchaeus' life, into Zacchaeus' house. And it says Zacchaeus received him joyfully. With joy he received him. Do we receive Jesus with joy? Now, many times I've participated in baptisms of people, and I've seen the joy of people when they go through that. When Jesus comes into our lives, we receive him joyfully. And this is what Zacchaeus does. He's glad, he's joyful to receive Jesus. Remember we said when Jesus stopped and looked up to the tree, the people who were with him, they also saw Zacchaeus. So Luke tells us about that in the next verse. He says, but when they saw it, there's the word again, see. When they see Zacchaeus, when they see that Jesus is inviting himself into Zacchaeus' house, when they see that Jesus is wanting to go sit and eat and fellowship with Zacchaeus, they all complained. Now, I don't know whether they means even the disciples of Jesus, but I would like to think it means the Pharisees and the other people. But the disciples of Jesus probably were used to this already, that Jesus seemed to like to hang out with sinners. He seems to like to hang out with tax collectors that everybody avoids. So they probably were used to this. So when they see him wanting to go to Zacchaeus' house, they know that's what's going to happen. Already he has called one tax collector, Matthew, to be amongst them. They hated him, but Jesus made them accept Matthew as a tax collector, as one of them. And so they are now accepting that. So the point for us as believers is to say we must learn to see those that Jesus sees. We must learn to accept those that Jesus accepts. But we must not be like these ones who, when they see who Jesus accepts, when they see it is Zacchaeus, they complain saying, he has gone to be a guest with a man who is a sinner. They object to the fact that Jesus is reaching out, is seeking after the lost, after sinners. They complain about that. Now, if we're not careful, even as believers, we can behave like that. That when we see sinners, we see people that are rejected by society because they are in drugs or they're alcoholics or whatever they've done, and everybody shuns them. For the sake of our own status in society, we also reject people on the same basis. And perhaps Luke is saying, no, behold such people. See those people, because Jesus sees them. He knows them by name. That's why he comes to Zacchaeus and says, Zacchaeus. Jesus knows those. So the people that the world rejects, Jesus sees those people. Jesus knows their name. And he wants his disciples to also see those people, to also share the gospel with them. That's what us as disciples of Jesus are expected to do. They are complaining. Why is he going to Zacchaeus' house? I'm sure there are other rabbis in the town of Jericho who might have wanted Jesus to come to their house. They are more righteous than Zacchaeus. Why doesn't Jesus, as a righteous man, come to their house? Why does he go to the sinner's house? I think Luke, once again, with his theme of tax collectors and sinners and so on, he wants to remind us that Jesus came to save the lost. And the question that challenges us with this story is that we should not be people who only go to the houses of believers, only to the houses of the good people. We need to be going out to people who need to know the gospel, to sinners, people who society doesn't give a time of day. Jesus sees those people, and we too must see them. We too must reach out to them with the gospel. And sometimes we must invite ourselves like Jesus did, because some of them are probably even afraid of inviting you. I've had situations where as soon as people hear I am a pastor, they don't want to engage with me. They don't want to talk to me. They don't want to be seen with me because they feel ashamed of themselves. They feel embarrassed. And so we need to be inviting ourselves into their spaces. We need to be making them comfortable. We need them to know that the Jesus that we worship sees them. And because of that, we also see them and share the gospel with them. And then Zacchaeus, at this dinner that they are now having at his house, then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I've taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold." Now, I don't know, I didn't mention this when it started. Do you know what the name Zacchaeus means? The name Zacchaeus means pure. It means clean. It means innocent. In today's terms, Zacchaeus' name would have been innocent. We know people who are called innocent in a society today. That's what his name means. But for Jewish people, he was anything but innocent. He was evil, he was a sinner, he was unclean. And yet his name meant the exact opposite of that. His name meant the exact opposite. Now, this passage where Zacchaeus says, I give half of my goods to the poor. In the Greek, it is very ambiguous. It reads the same way, actually, the way I'm reading it. It says, I give half of my goods to the poor. So he's not saying, I will start giving. He's saying, I do this. So you can read it to say, this is how Zacchaeus was. Even though he was a tax collector, he used to give half of his wealth to the poor. It also can be read the way most people read it, to say, from today, I'm going to start giving half of my wealth to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody, I will restore, I will repay 4 times. I'll pay back the money. See, the phrase pay back the money was not coined by South African politicians. This is something that is biblical. That if you are rich and you have gained from the exploitation of other people, you must pay back the money to them. You must restore that which you have stolen, that which you have taken. So here the passage is either Zacchaeus was somebody who does this already, or he was saying, because now I want to follow you, Jesus, I will start doing these things. You can read it either way. But I think Zacchaeus was a man who was already doing this. I think he was already, before he met Jesus, God had been working in his life already. He had already started helping the poor with his wealth. He had already started, when he discovered that there was somebody who was cheated, he was repaying them what was stolen from them. And Jesus said to him, after Zacchaeus says, I give to the poor and I repay what was taken unforcefully. Jesus says to him, today salvation has come to this house. Remember I said today has to do with salvation? When you hear the word today, you must expect salvation to happen. And this is what Jesus says. Today salvation has come. Earlier he said, today I must be at your house. And that evening Jesus says, today salvation has come to your house, to this house. Because, and this is important, look what he says about Zacchaeus. Because he, Zacchaeus, is a son of Abraham. See, the other sons of Abraham, the other Jews in Jericho and the surrounding areas, rejected Zacchaeus. They didn't want to be seen with him. Probably even his family rejected him. They said, you're no longer one of us. You are no longer a son of Abraham. But Jesus restores him to that. He breaks down the wall that they'd built around Zacchaeus. Now, Zacchaeus for them was like the old inhabitants of Jericho. He was not one of them. But Jesus comes and says, this wall that you've built around Zacchaeus, who is a son of Abraham, it must come down. And Jesus saves Zacchaeus and he destroys that wall. And Zacchaeus becomes one of Jesus' disciples. Today salvation has come to this house because he also is a son of Abraham. Now we know in the book of Galatians, Paul tells us that descendants of sons of Abraham are not only those who are descendants of Abraham by genealogy only. It is those who are believers in Jesus. It is through Jesus that we become sons, true sons of Abraham. And Jesus says that here. Those that are rejecting Zacchaeus because they say he's not a son of Abraham because he has turned his back. In accepting Jesus, Zacchaeus is the son of Abraham. And Jesus affirms that in the ears of everybody listening. He says he is a son of Abraham. I know you have rejected him. I know you have pushed him out of society. You don't want to be seen with him. You don't see him as part of the Jewish community. But he is the son of Abraham. There are many people in our society today that we have cut out We never see in our minds, we can't see these people at church. We can't see them as believers. Maybe we must begin to see them the way Jesus sees them. Because Jesus sees them. He knows their names and he wants to save them. Maybe we must be the disciples of Jesus. That as we walk through with him, when he looks up, wherever people are, whether they are stuck in a tree somewhere, whatever situation they are stuck in, when Jesus sees those people, we must also see them and reach out to them. Because Jesus has reached out to those people. And then he says as he ends, for the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. Jesus has come to save the lost. This theme for Luke is central. That's why he tells us about the lost son, the lost coin, and the lost sheep. That's why he tells about the tax collector who goes to pray with the Pharisees who rejects him, but God accepts him. Okay? So Luke has this theme that God in Jesus has come to seek the lost. He wants to save them. He wants them to be saved. And as disciples of Jesus, we are invited to do that. We are expected to do that. So as believers, that's the message we need to take away. That we must learn to see the people that Jesus sees. For Jesus is working in their lives. He knows their name and he wants to save them. And through us, Jesus wants to reach them with the gospel. Let's see those that Jesus sees. Let's seek after those that Jesus is seeking. But the second part, I want to speak to those that maybe you're not a believer yet. You're not baptized, you're not a believer, but you're interested to know this Jesus. You are like Zacchaeus, who wanted to know who Jesus was. Maybe you do want to know him, but maybe you have not been serious until today. It says Zacchaeus was serious. He ran ahead and climbed into a tree, embarrassing himself. Maybe today you can be like Zacchaeus. Forget about the status and forget about what people are going to say if they hear that you are now a believer. Forget about what people are going to think of you when they hear that you've been baptized. Be like Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus climbs to a tree because he wants to know who this Jesus. This Jesus that met Zacchaeus on that day, he also wants to meet you. He is inviting himself into your life. He says, make haste. Come down quickly. From whatever status you have put yourself in, Jesus says, come down quickly because today I'm coming into your life. Will you allow him? Will you accept him? Zacchaeus accepted Jesus joyfully into his house. And Jesus today is calling you. Come down from the tree where you've put yourself. Come out from wherever you've been hiding. Today, I want to come into your life. That's the message that Jesus is giving you today. Will you, like Zacchaeus, receive him joyfully? It says Zacchaeus received Jesus joyfully into his house. Today is the day of salvation for you. You can welcome Jesus into your life. You see, we don't invite Jesus into our lives. He comes into our lives. Chances are Jesus has been speaking to you even before today's message. There are things that have been happening in your life that has made you wonder about God. Those were not coincidence. God has been seeking you. And today, maybe through this message, God has arrived. He says, today, I want to come into your life. Today for you is the day of salvation. Will you welcome Jesus into your life like Zacchaeus? I call upon you that if today you have made that decision to say, this message speaks to me, I want to be like Zacchaeus. I want to take the step that Zacchaeus did by accepting Jesus into his life. Today is my day of salvation. Today I want to accept Jesus into my life. I want to accept Jesus' offer of salvation. Today I say yes. At the end of this message, there is an email address. Drop us an email and say, today I've decided I want to meet Jesus. I want Jesus into my life. We will make arrangements for you, and you can be part of those that follow Jesus. May God bless you as you take that step that Zacchaeus took 2,000 years ago. Amen.